Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to this week's episode of In Therapy. This week's episode is a continuation in our between season episodes, where we are exploring some of the key themes that arise within the episodes. And in this week's session, I wanted to explore the subject of trauma. This is something that we've talked a number of times about actually right through In Therapy, but particularly was one of the themes that showed up for Hayley as part of her story. And I know there's a lot of questions about what trauma is. Do we all have trauma? Do you have trauma? And also, how does trauma shape our lives? And so I'm going to unpack a little bit of that in this week's episode, but it's also to serve as an invitation. I'm going to be doing a 5-day video journey starting on next Monday, exploring the subject of Decode Your Trauma. And you can sign up for this free 5-part video series where I'll walk you through how to decode your trauma for free at decodeyourtrauma.com. So let's start with the basic question. What is trauma? I think a lot of us think about trauma in the more classic sense of PTSD trauma, where perhaps we've had a serious car accident, or we've suddenly lost someone we're very close to, or perhaps we found ourselves in a war zone, and there's a very sudden and major overloading of our capacity to process and metabolize and experience. And although it's true those are traumas, trauma can happen to us in many, many different ways. In fact, one of the real challenges with trauma is that there's those overt, those more obvious traumas, but sometimes the things that most shape us are much more covert, they're much more subtle. If we look at Hayley's journey, one of the big impacts on her was her relationship with her mum. And there were some experiences that were clearly traumatic experiences, but also there was a general theme right through her childhood of Hayley's mum's needs being more important than Hayley's, and Hayley having to learn to adapt her behavior, her inner landscape, to find a way to feel safe and lovable in her relationship with her mother. And that is ultimately a trauma. It shaped Hayley in a lot of different ways as we unpack together in the series. And so the more better understood, let's say, way of understanding trauma in therapeutic circles over the last 30 or so years has been the amazing research that was done on adverse childhood experiences. So this may be, for example, having being abandoned by a parent, or having someone in the family with addictions, or someone being incarcerated in prison. These very significant, impactful experiences in childhood. But again, these more covert, these more subtle experiences can actually shape us more in some ways because we don't recognize, because we don't realize the impact they have upon us. And trauma is more complicated than just the events, because you can have two people that go through the same event, but the impact on their life is different. And more recently, I've been talking about trauma as being like an echo. Firstly, literally like an echo, that something that gradually spreads in its impact, but also echo as an acronym. And I'll touch on this briefly now, but if you sign up for the 5-day video series of the Decode Your Trauma program at decodeyourtrauma.com, we're going to unpack this in a lot more detail. But the E of echo is the events. And we just talked a little bit about what they may be. They may be overt, obvious traumatic events, but they may be these much more subtle, much more covert experiences that we have. But the C of echo is the context. It's the environment within which those events happen. How resilient we are to meet those events has a really big impact on how they shape us. So the question is, what determines our resilience? So we have 3 core emotional needs as children. As children, we are dependent upon our caregivers to meet those needs for us. As adults, we're able to learn to meet those needs for ourselves. And those needs, very briefly, and we went into some of this in Haley's sessions, these needs are the need for boundaries. That's the ability to say no to other people and to ourselves, but also our capacity to say yes, to invite more of what we want. So if we have our boundaries well met, we learn how to set good boundaries, that it becomes somewhat of a buffer towards some of the experiences that we may have. The second of these 3 core emotional needs is safety. As children, this is through co-regulation. Our nervous system learns to be safe by the nervous systems of the people around us. As an adult, this is learning how to self-regulate our nervous system. Our capacity to be in a calm, healing state is not dependent upon others. We learn to do that for ourselves, but we learn to do that through the co-regulation we experience. The third of these core emotional needs is love. This is not just knowing we're loved as an idea. It's feeling that we're loved. Often one of the keys to feeling loved as a child is the quality contact and time that we have with the people that are caring for us, that we feel they are genuinely interested in us, interested in our inner world, and they love us where we are, not for who they think we should be at some point in the future. And so the context of these 3 core emotional needs being met or not being met, and how well we then learn to meet them for ourselves, has a big impact on how those events will shape us. The H of Echo is our homeostatic balance. This is whether our nervous system stays in a calm, balanced, healing state, or we go into what I call a maladaptive stress response. This is where our nervous system becomes consistently dysregulated. This is one of the ways that trauma has the biggest impact in our lives. If we have childhood trauma and our nervous system becomes dysregulated, this has impacts on everything from anxiety to depression to addictions to chronic health issues to ultimately our capacity to heal. Just like our physical body has a natural instinct towards healing, so does our emotional body. But if we're in a maladaptive stress response, that capacity to heal is inhibited. So not only does the homeostatic shift impact and shape our lives, it also impacts our ability to heal from the impacts of trauma. So we have the events, we have the context within which the events happen, 3 core emotional needs. We have the homeostatic shifts that happen in our nervous system. We then have the outcomes in our lives. What do we learn to do to manage the impacts that have happened? Do we learn that to be loved, we constantly have to drive ourselves and achieve? Or do we learn that to feel safe, we have to get everything perfectly right all of the time? Or do we learn that our sense of capacity to really show up as ourselves is dependent upon predicting the behavior of other people, and there's only certain conditions that we can allow ourselves to fully show up and to be present? So the real suffering of the events of trauma is not what happens at the time, as difficult as that may be. It's how our nervous system changes and the beliefs, the habits, and the behaviors that we develop in our lives in response to this. To look at this a little bit in reverse, to support our trauma healing, we have to learn to regulate our nervous system, to learn to self-regulate our nervous system, to bring that homeostatic balance of our nervous system back into balance. We then have to learn how to repattern those habits, those behaviors, those ways we've learned to cope with our trauma, which often are perpetuating the cycle. In a sense, we are recreating for ourselves the environment we grew up in. We may no longer be trapped in that environment, but we're now trapping ourselves in that environment until we learn to effectively meet those 3 core emotional needs. So, if you'd like to have a roadmap for understanding the echoes of your trauma, the events you may have experienced, whether you got your 3 core emotional needs met, what's happening in the homeostatic balance in your nervous system, and what the outcomes may be in your life, and how can you learn to rebalance and to heal these different impacts, do sign up for this free 5-day course at decodeyourtrauma.com. I'd love you to come on this journey with me. It's going to be 30 to 40 minutes a day, but you'll also be able to access the videos through the 5 days if you miss a day as we go through the journey together. In terms of in therapy, we're getting super excited for starting with our next new participant. In next week's episode, we're going to have a little teaser. You're going to get to meet our next new participant. Then in the following week, we'll have their first session. So if you haven't already, please do. If you're listening to the podcast, subscribe as a podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. This will make sure that you find out as the new episodes are released, but it also really helps us because it tells the podcasting platform or it tells YouTube that this is content that you're enjoying, which means it will show the content to more people. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to us meeting our next new participant next week.